Hey guys, it's Blitzcard back with more Genshin Impact. I was intending to write an investment guide video, but with the release of the Childe banner, I thought it right for me to release a guide for him, just like the Venti guide I made when Venti's rerun banner was released. I must say that Childe isn't someone that's easy to make a guide for. I've done a review of Childe on multiple occasions, and I'm not surprised if there would be future videos on Childe again when there's a significant update on his value based on future rosters. And being a 5-star that improves his team, Childe has one of the best potentials to grow in the future when they release characters with stronger melt or vape synergies. As usual, I'll start with the pros and cons, and then I'll discuss his kits, his constellations, his roles, his builds, his team comms, and then end the video with some gameplay highlights. Without further ado, let's get into it. The reason why I start with pros and cons is to answer the basic question, is Childe worth it? It's an early summary for you guys to decide if it's worth building or pulling for Childe. Let's start with his strengths first. Number 1, Childe has a very strong AoE potential that gets stronger the more enemies you are facing. Number 2, quick setup on a high burst damage. Speedrunners love Childe. Number 3, strong AoE hydro application. The AoE aspect makes him the best character to synergize with Xiangling's ultimate. These 3 are the most unique things about Childe, but other strengths include he has a low energy requirement because his range burst attack refunds some energies back. He's also not constellation reliant, it means he's good enough at C0. And lastly, he has a flexible team option. Next, we move on to Childe's downsides. Number 1, he has a lower personal damage output compared to other 5-star DPS. The main reason is because his autos are a setup for a reaction, which is usually the job of a sub DPS. Childe is also very team oriented, which means he requires spread out investment. That in itself is not a bad thing because it's common to build the team's sub DPS damage, but it does mean that until you have at least 2 characters built, the output is vastly inferior to a hyper carry that is being enabled by a minimally invested sub DPS. A typical example of this is Diluc, whose damage output is very strong even when you are being supported by a level 1 Xingqiu, as long as Xingqiu has 100% ultimate uptime. Next, Childe has questionable constellation values because his constellations don't necessarily upgrade his damage potential. You are forced to do a rotation management with a challenging cooldown management, and you are being punished for poor rotation management heavily. And lastly, he has an extremely strong synergy with Bennett, which means that the team output is significantly worse without Bennett. You can consider him married to Bennett in as much as Diluc is married to Xingqiu. Now this in itself isn't inherently a weakness, it's just that you only have 1 copy of Bennett, so in Spiral Abyss you may have to consider a second team that doesn't use Bennett. Let's move on to his kit. Unlike other characters, we probably have to spend a little bit more time with Childe's kit because there's quite a bit more going on with him. Let's start with Childe's autos. The autos mostly refer to the damage done by Childe in the bow form. If you're not on bow, the damage that comes from this talent is usually the Riptide burst, which is proc when an enemy is killed while having the Riptide mark on. This is usually the least important part of Childe's arsenal, but there are situations in which you will want to use the charge attack. Typically, it's because you want to apply Riptide from afar or you are unable to attack in the melee form. There is some merit in leveling this talent, but it's definitely the lowest priority. There are also some important techs to improve the charge shot, but for that, please check out I Win to Lose Gaming's video as he does an excellent job in covering that mechanical aspect. The link is provided in the description below. Childe's elemental skill switches him into the melee form and is usually Childe's most important skill. This is also the most complex bit of his talents. Let's first of all talk about how the cooldown works with Childe. Take a look at the diagram here, credits to AVS5138. On the left column, you have the time you spend in Childe's melee form. The column beside it is the resulting downtime. So let's say you exit at 9 seconds, the downtime becomes 15 seconds. The rest of the columns describe how much shorter the downtime would be if you bring bonuses that will reduce Childe's downtime. Usually the optimal time for Childe to be on the field if you're at C0 is around 7 to 9 seconds, assuming that your team requires more than 1 rotation to clear the content. Any longer than 9 seconds usually means that Childe is basically unavailable for the next rotation. The 9-second mark is because many important skills have a 20-second cooldown like Xiangling's ultimate, so as Xiangling's ultimate takes 9 seconds of Childe's field time, 9 seconds is a time where you can safely have Childe ready for the next time Xiangling's ultimate is on for the second time. Next, we discuss Childe's most optimal strengths. N is normal attack, C is charge attack. You can read the ranking here, but basically the earlier you use Childe's charge attack, the higher the DPS will be. However, continuously using N1C will consume a crazy amount of stamina. For that reason, N3C is generally recommended. I'm sorry if the color code is a bit confusing here, but what I'm saying is the stronger the green color, the more I'm recommending the string. The red color refers to the string I don't recommend, not the string that has a negative stamina output. While N5C may be the weakest attack string, using the jump cancel will actually result in a positive stamina, so this could be useful for when you need the stamina to do a lot of dodging. In contrast, there may be certain circumstances where you would only have a short window of time to DPS, such as when you are facing the elemental world bosses. Feel free to use N1C to land as much damage as possible. At the end of the day, this is the data, but use your own judgment call for the best strings to use in different situations. Also, Rust is the only weapon where the optimal string is N5C because Rust increases the damage of normal attacks. When you combine the optimal string and the optimal field time, you end up with 4 strings of N3C or 3 strings of N5C. And remember, if you are on melee but you are not enabling any attack, you are wasting Childe's time on the field. Moving on to Elemental Burst, this is the source of Childe's huge burst attack and is the reason why he is married to Bennett. It's normally recommended to use the ranged burst as long as you are facing 2 or fewer enemies. The reason is because the melee burst has a longer animation and the Riptide scaling is worth it only when you are facing 3 or more enemies. Thankfully, the ranged burst is much easier to set up, and it also means that Childe can make do with a lower ER to have a strong ultimate uptime, which is usually around 120% ER. An exception to this would be if you use the melee burst as a finisher. For talent priorities, generally is E, Q, auto, but if you are using Childe in a quick swap team and most of the time is spent on just rotating your team's ultimate, then of course it becomes Q, E, auto. Either way, leveling both the E and Q would not be a mistake, just as long as you are leveling the autos last. For Childe's Constellations, I'll go through what they do and then give my comments regarding each one. C1, it decreases the cooldown of Childe's melee form by 20%. Practically, C1 allows you to be in a melee form for about 2 seconds more, which is down to about just 1 more string of attack. It makes rotating through your team easier, but I don't think it's worth the upgrade. Just to put things into perspective of what a great C1 is like, you can take a look at Ganyu's or Hu Tao's C1. C2, you get energies from dead enemies. The situation where you need more energy is usually when you are facing bosses, but this constellation doesn't help at all. It activates nicely when you are facing smaller enemies, but you usually get lots of energies easily from smaller enemies in the first place. A very poor constellation in my opinion. C3, it increases E talent by 3 levels. This is the biggest DPS boost for Childe's general DPS. If you are pursuing Childe's Constellation, this could be a good spot to stop. C4 allows Childe to continuously proc Hydro while he is off the field. This is a support or utility constellation. Arguably, this makes Childe the best Hydro support for Freeze Ganyu, but Ganyu is practically the only one that will benefit from this at the moment. Having a Hydro proc can actually very easily mess up Childe's vape teams, as it messes up with the order of elemental proc. Without a toggleable constellation feature, getting C4 can mean that Childe is better on only freeze and electro teams, so be careful about this constellation. C5 is a big burst DPS improvement. C6, when you use Childe's burst on the melee form, the cooldown is reset. The most controversial constellation. This is the constellation that allows Childe to be a hyper carry. For co-op, this allows Childe to be on the melee form at all times. Let's just get it out of the way. Normally, only whales will be chasing after C6 constellations for limited characters in this game. And this constellation, once you are a whale, has very little value because Childe gets so strong the battle is usually over very quickly. It's a constellation that non-whales can value, but is too far for non-whales. Having said all that, Childe can clear Spiral Abyss contents with 3 stars effectively at C0, so personally I don't recommend going beyond C0. Let's move on to Childe's role, and before stating what his role is, let's define what the roles are. Main DPS is somebody who takes the longest field time. Sustained DPS is somebody who does damage over time. Enabler is somebody who increases the damage of other team members, usually by applying an elemental aura that later will be procced. Burst DPS is somebody who does big damage from a small time window, usually by the press of an ultimate. Support is the hardest to define, but basically if you do any of these things, buff, debuff, crowd control, off the field activity to support the main DPS, healing, shielding or cleansing. Childe is all of this: main DPS, sustained DPS, enabler, burst DPS and potentially support. But unlike main DPSs in general, the reason why his DPS level isn't on the same level as the likes of Diluc is because his attacks are so fast that they become a setup that enables his team rather than them enabling him. So the interesting thing is that while he may have the role of sustained main DPS, arguably, his main role is as an enabler. The main chunk of the damage relies on other team members. It's not that Childe doesn't do good damage when he's on the field, it's just that the bulk of your team damage when your team members are fully invested, they will do more damage than Childe. So arguably, Childe's team is more important to build than Childe. Let's move on to his build. First of all, let's get weapons out of the way. Without a doubt, Skyward Harp is the best weapon for him, as it's usually the best weapon for all the archers in the game, except for Ganyu of course. Other than that, the next best weapon choice is usually the Viridescent Hunt. There are a couple of reasons why this is so. The passive has a great synergy with Childe's AoE, as Childe himself doesn't have any way to group enemies together, so just the fact that you can group enemies with this is already a great deal. But also the total damage from Viridescent Hunt scales with attack, so when it is affected by the attack buff from Bennett, you could easily end up with more total damage than even Refined 5 Rust, making Viridescent Hunt arguably the best 4-star for Childe, with the only caveat being that this weapon is only available on the Battle Pass. If you don't have either of these two weapons, feel free to use Amos Bow or Rust. And if you don't have any of those weapons, you can use the Stringless, even though the weapon itself is better for quick swap teams, but at least it doesn't have any quirky downsides like reduced charge shot damage. Moving on to artifacts. In general, 4-piece Heart of Death, shortened HOD, is the best in slot for Childe. Even though 2-piece Noblesse greatly increases his burst damage, Childe's total DPS from his sustained attacks will net more damage from 4-piece HOD. If you can't get 4-piece HOD, you can use either 2-piece Gladiator or 2-piece Noblesse, and if you are on Electro Charge team, 4-piece Thunderstooter is not a bad option. The stats are very simple. Build him like a normal DPS using Attack Sense, Hydro Cup, and Crit Headgear. For substats, the priority is to get 120% energy recharge, and then crit, and then attack, and then EM. EM will play a role for his burst output, but because the large chunk of his damage is not reaction based, and Electro Charge does very little damage, attack is a lot more important than EM. Now team comps. Because Childe is team centric, he has a long list of viable team options. Before going through a long list of them, I would just like to say that these are the most important characters usually involved in a Childe's team: Bennett, Xiangling, Sucrose, Xingqiu, Fischl, Beidou. And to a lesser extent, these characters may also have a spot: Venti, Albedo, Ganyu, Jin. Let's go through the logic for how to build a team. First, we have to consider, what reactions are possible from Hydro: Vape, Electro Charge, and Freeze. For Vape, if Childe is an enabler, then who has the best off-the-field pyro damage? The answer is Xiangling. But also, Childe's ultimate is a huge damage, and is there a way to enable this without wasting Xiangling's ultimate? The answer is Bennett's ultimate, great range in applying AoE pyro, and it buffs Childe's damage, plus Bennett fulfills the role of a healer too. On top of this, Xiangling and Bennett share the same elements, so they will have an easier time to get their ultimates up. So for Vape team, these three, Childe, Xiangling, and Bennett, make the basic building core. So for the last team slot, there are a few candidates to select, all with their own pros and cons. Sucrose provides a team-wide EM buff, grouping capacity, Viridescent Veneer access, and she is very cheap to build. Xingqiu provides stagger resist, damage reduction, small heal, plus a more consistent hydro application, And when Childe is not available, can also be used to enable Vape Bennett. And lastly, he provides a lot of hydro energy for Childe. Fischl provides a steady stream of energy, good single target damage, usually have no problem with providing energy for herself, enables Thunder Fury Bennett, with the downside that she is mostly single target. Beidou provides damage reduction, shielding at Constellation 1, parry, amazing AoE damage at Constellation 2, but she is the opposite of Fischl. If you only have a single enemy, then her damage output is much lower. And without a double Electro team, she has a high energy recharge requirement to have an efficient ultimate uptime. Albedo similar to Fischl but with less synergy in exchange for a stream of crystallized shield. The cheapest team to build will be Sucrose, followed by Xingqiu, whereas a fourth member brought in for damage like Beidou will require a heavy investment. The next reaction is Electro Charge, shortened as EC. The approach is to bring an Electro to pair with Childe's field time. The most popular team is the Fireworks team that consists of Childe, Fischl, Beidou, and Bennett. But basically this is how you approach it. Start with your first Electro sub DPS, either Fischl or Beidou. The healer for this team is the most flexible because no healer will mess this team up, but Bennett and Jean have stronger synergies. The last slot is a flex slot, usually filled by a second Electro, an Anemo, or a second Hydro like Xingqiu. So if for any reason you can't use Bennett in your team, this is my second go-to team for Childe. Then for the last reaction, we have the freeze team, Childe, Ganyu, Venti plus Bennett or Diona. The reason why freeze team works with Venti is because frozen enemies will stay on the ground. But for the most part, I don't recommend freeze teams because of the lower damage, and it feels like it's a waste for Ganyu to be a support character instead of a main DPS. But if you're obsessed with freeze team, then this would be the way to go. Bear in mind that freeze teams are heavily dependent on having Ganyu, as Chaos Ultimate isn't sufficient enough, so freeze teams depend on a 5-star. While I personally don't like this team, when Childe is Constellation 4, you turn his role as a Hydro support for main DPS Ganyu. I think that team is incredible because a C4 Childe is a better Hydro sub DPS compared to Mona or Xingqiu for Ganyu. Lastly, quick swap team. For a general purpose, I only recommend this team if you have Venti because Sucrose's ultimate chaining doesn't have quite the same impact as Venti's. So you start pairing Childe with Venti, then you bring Bennett to boost Childe's burst damage as usual. The last candidate is ideally someone that can burst into Venti's Pyro Infusion. Ganyu, Albedo, Chongyun are the best burst candidates. Because it's expensive to build all these teams for Childe, if you want to use the cheapest team, you should pair Childe with either Xiangling or an Electro sub DPS like Fischl or Beidou, and then add Sucrose for Viridescent Venera, and the last slot goes to Bennett. For Bennett, all you need is to farm the 4-piece Noblesse, use an ER Sense on Bennett, and then slap a level 90 weapon on him while getting his ultimate to as high as possible. I can't believe we're already at the end of the video, but here are some gameplay highlights. I'll start with the classic Fireworks team, and then you guys can see some popular team variations tackling the Spiral Abyss. If you're using Childe and you feel like you're not doing enough damage, it's possible that you haven't invested enough in other characters like Xiangling or Beidou. Otherwise, even with a C0 Childe, you should be able to clear the last floor of Spiral Abyss with 3 stars. Let's take a look at how the super budget team fares in Spiral Abyss Flow 12. It's doable, but it's not my favorite team comp because there is no shield or stagger reduction, so if you don't end the battle quickly on your second rotation, it's easy to get bashed left, right, center. Whereas if you compare it to this one, it's much easier to get a lot more attacks in because Xingqiu makes it harder for Childe to get interrupted. You will also see how I switch out of Childe as soon as Xiangling's ultimate is gone. Another way to manage your cooldown is by using your sub DPS as timer in terms of how long you should be on the field. Finally, I'll show you guys what it's like when you combine the two most devastating 4-star AoE users in the game. The challenge is in getting them to enough ER and respectable damage, but as you will see, if you can get their ultimates up for the second rotation, the enemies will go down very quickly. If this video has been helpful, please leave a like and subscribe for more Genshin Impact content. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Have a great one, guys. Bye bye.